Um, yeah, some more intro on Derek and I. I'll let Derek introduce himself.
Also, I also have cats, and they're currently fighting. So you'll hear growling and screaming behind me probably. That will just happen for the next couple weeks, regardless, I'm sure. Um, cool, yeah. So I'm Derek. I think many of you already know me. I'm a machine learning artist at night, but obviously during the day, I'm a graphic designer. I currently work at MailChimp, doing UI, UX design, like a lot of you. So, everyone's stories about how they came to machine learning mirrors very much what I do. I've been doing this for maybe 2 or 3 years now, I think. Um, my background is that actually, if you go to the next slide, Leah.
Mm-hmm.
Um, so me, probably, God, it's probably been 2.5 years now, but I went to a program called SFPC, which is the School for Poetic Computation in New York. It's like fairly well known. It's run by Zach Lieberman and a bunch of other great folks. They did like was it a 1 week or 2 week? They did like a 1 week, like sort of machine learning intensive where I like learned from a lot of these folks. And if you're not familiar with these people's names, I'd definitely recommend looking them up on Twitter or Googling their names, because I think almost all of them have like a deep background in machine learning, whether it's making machine learning art or being a machine learning art critic or other things. Chris at the time was, I believe, an ITP graduate student, and now he has run. Now he runs Runway, so like it's sort of like a funny continuation of things. So I had a similar experience to like this class, right? I was just throwing a bunch of stuff, and I like ingested all of it. I took like 6 months off from making machine learning art because this class was so intense. And then I slowly came back around to it and realized that like my focus, which is on like image and video, was something that was still like Gene does a ton of work in like educating people in this area, but I felt there was still like some gaps in this. So like I started up these classes sort of as a way to sort of not have the same issues that I had when I was learning this stuff. Next slide. So this was some of my very, very early work, which looks kind of funny now because one, the technology is much better, and two, like I just know what I'm doing now. But this is some early stuff that I made. On the left is a GAN, which we'll talk about a lot this week over the next couple weeks. And on the right is style transfer, which we'll also talk about. Next slide. And then here's some of the work that I'm doing now. So these are some illustrations I just recently did for Baffler magazine. So I've started to move, like I do some of this in just a purely artistic context, but then I also do some of this as illustration work for clients, that sort of thing. So was asked to, this sort of process where like it's built into, I did some Photoshop work, and then my last step was some machine learning style transfer stuff. So one of the things we'll talk about over the next couple weeks is just like, how do you build this into your own working process? And how do you like sort of make it fit? Because, there's a certain look to machine learning art, and like it doesn't have to be all you make. There are ways to sort of build it into your process to either be a final layer or be a really early layer. And I think that'll be really cool to see how all of you take your own experiences and mold that into how you work. Cool. Oh, that's just another illustration from Baffler.
Okay, and how I got started with this course was I was a computer science major and like was a software engineer. Started doing work in GANs, generative adversarial networks, and yeah, this was uh, a workshop paper I wrote for NERDS, which is a big machine learning conference on machine generated artwork. And then I went to SFPC, the School for Poetic Computation, in fall 2019, and then got connected to Derek through SFPC. And then since then, this is some of my work. I'll let this play. Yeah, so generally, I think I've become more interested in making video work. Here's another piece I made. This is with a model called Next Frame Prediction. This I just took the beginning of an Adult Swim off the air episode and then fed it through the network. Yeah, and it just gets really fun and kind of trippy. Yeah, cool. And so enough about Derek and I. We're gonna go on to a demo the very first machine learning model in Runway. I'll stop sharing my screen, and Derek, I'll let you take it from here.
Cool. Yeah. So we've probably done enough talking now, and we want to start making some things. So I'm just gonna do a really quick little demo of a model called AttnGAN. So what I would love for everyone to do, while I get everything set up over here, is for you to write a sentence. That's it. Just think of a sentence, and if you can, for me, just put it in the chat of our Zoom, and I'll have Leah pick out a couple of her favorites. Yeah. So go ahead and just like think of a sentence and give yourself like 2 minutes, and then we'll get started. So we'll do a full demo of Runway and everything right now. For now, don't worry about what I'm doing. Just sort of like look at the output of what we're gonna take from these models. So, Leah, do you want to pick out a couple for me here?
Yeah. Dan wrote, "I found a stick on the ground."
All right, cool. So the way this model works is you just give it a sentence, and it generates an image from that sentence. So this is the model generating, "I found a stick on the ground." I'm just going to save these so we've got them for later. You have another one?
Yeah. Arnav wrote, "The funeral will be on Zoom."
It's a little dark. Where is that one? There we go. All right, cool. So the funeral will be on Zoom. All right. Let's do 2 more.
Pizza party tonight.
All right. Let's see how this model interprets pizza. Oh, there we go. Okay, cool.
Music moves everyone.
All right. And actually, I really love the quick round fox jumps over a lazy dog. I just want to see what this one looks like. So that would be funny. All right, awesome. Cool. So if I didn't get to yours, you're welcome to play with this later. This is just a model called AttnGAN. I'll walk through how to find it later in Runway. So now we've seen a couple of your generated images. I'm going to generate a couple images myself, and then we're going to talk about sort of what we see here. So I'm going to do the dog chased the ball in the park. All right. And then I'm going to do the car was parked on the beach. And actually, I'm just going to remove this and say the car was parked. But yeah, any ones you can think of that I should try?
The dog was inside the car.
Oh, that's good. I like that one. All right, awesome. Okay, so now we've played with this a little bit. I just want to sort of hear from everyone, like, what was that experience like? What did you think was interesting? What stood out to you? So you can just unmute yourself and talk. We don't need to call or raise hands or anything.
It looked like it was interpreting what you were saying in real time. Like as you type things, it was sort of guessing as you went along. Does that make sense? Like through the sentence?
Yeah, so if you type the dog was in the car. Yeah, so it is sort of real time, right? Every word updates to it. Any other thoughts from people?
How drastically it changed from every single word being added. So it wasn't just like a kind of linear, just like blend or like latent space move. So like there, it was just completely random.
Yep.
I guess one thing I'm curious about is, I can tell, dog and car can sort of spur certain things, but was in, like, what does that do anything? And yeah.
Yeah.
Interesting that the things move around the square in different ways. Like the dog doesn't just stay in one spot, or it gets bigger, or I don't know, morphs.
I'm curious about the blurriness and what is, I mean, what kind of decisions is being made because the blurriness is ambiguous. It makes you think maybe it's this, maybe it's another stuff. It's very interesting.
Totally.
I'm curious about in what type of data set is trained on, because what happens if you only put dog or cat? It works or just blow off? It seems like it blow off.
Yeah, so I heard lots of different phrases here that I think all touched on sort of like what we'll be talking about for the next couple weeks. I heard, so David mentioned data sets. Yesenia sort of mentioned, blurriness, or like what is it trained on? Like how does this work? So one thing I would, I always like, I love using this model because I also like it because my personal feeling is that this is not a good model, right? So when you hear people across the world talk about how machine learning is going to like change the world and like it's already doing all these things and we have self-driving cars, right? Like then you look at this model and you're like, the idea here is that if you give it text, it generates an image and it should be a realistic image of what the text you give it. This sucks at that. Like this is not doing a good job of that, of actually achieving that. So part of what you will explore in this class is like maybe lower your expectations a little bit of some of these machine learning models. So to tell you a little bit about how this model is trained, like it was trained on the way, and we'll talk a little bit more about training after our break, but the idea here is that this machine learning model was given sentences and images, right? So it's sort of like, here's an image of a dog in the park, and then someone wrote a caption for that, and the machine learning model's job is to essentially reverse engineer that, right? So it saw an image and it was given a caption, and it sort of said like, learn from these and be able to generate images now from captions. Part of the reason why some of these worked well and some of these didn't is, again, the data set. And we'll talk more about that after the break as well. This was trained on probably something like ImageNet, which, again, you don't need to know what that means, but it means that there's a diverse set of images of animals and objects. And that's why, when you see things like cars or cats or dogs or pizza, like those are probably in the data set. So therefore it knows those things. Whereas I'm trying to think if there was a question. So like, I think the music moves everyone. Like music is probably not visualized here, right? Like a violin or like, the phrase music and moving, like it has no concept of those because it wasn't included in the data set. So you've probably also heard about this, like just reading a little bit about machine learning, that like what it's trained on, the data set matters a lot. Which is why there's a bunch of ethical considerations about like, what are you including in the data set? What aren't you including? How much of that information are you giving to that sort of thing? So this is just a fun, really like sort of toy example to show you that like knowing about these models and what they've been trained on can help you sort of determine like how to manipulate them, right? So like, because I know that this was trained on images of cats and dogs and cars, I know to include those words because I will get some representation of them. And it's also like, I think to Yesenia's point, there was like, this is pretty abstract. These are pretty blurry. They're not like concrete figures. AttnGAN is actually a fairly old model now. It's from 2017, which I know doesn't sound that old, but that's like pretty old in terms of machine learning. So that's probably why we're not getting the best representation of images here. But also just because it's trained on another word that you'll hear us talk about, which is diversity. It's trained on lots of different images and lots of different objects, which means it is hard for the machine learning model to figure out how do I separate a car from a dog, like in terms of shapes, if I'm shown all these shapes all at once. So there's a bunch of stuff that goes on in this model, and we'll be exploring a lot more of it over the next couple weeks. And hopefully you'll understand a little bit more about why this model isn't producing the best images. But then you'll also find some other models. And I realize I'm using the word model a lot, and we might not know what that means yet. And we'll talk about that after the break as well. But essentially, like, you'll hopefully learn a little bit more about like how to approach any model you find within Runway and be able to tweak it and maybe learn a little bit about how it was trained and then how to manipulate that going forward. So with this, this is a great time for a break. So every week we're going to try to take a 5-minute break and hopefully never go over our hour and a half, but sometimes we might. So let's take a 5-minute break. Everybody stand up, go get some water, like do whatever you need to do. Let's come back at, well, here on the East Coast, it'll be 2:21. So 21 after, wherever you are. Cool, and we'll see everybody in a minute. Yeah, I got it, cool. Cool, so during the break, did anyone have any questions? I know like I probably can't answer everything immediately to AttnGAN, but were there any like immediate direct questions about the demo we did? Oh, Matthew, that's a great question, actually. Let me share where you should be in Slack. In Slack, there is, so basically ML image making is the overall Slack you should be in. And then there is a channel over here called Intro to ML Art. Matthew, let me see if you are in it. Well, if you're not, like, we'll figure out how to add you afterward. Okay, awesome.
That's cool. That's cool.
Yeah, all right, great. So yeah, so it looks like there might not be everyone in this Slack channel. If you're not in here, just let Lee or I know. You should be able to find it just by searching the channels. But yeah, it's this one in Slack. So just, I think it's actually a great intro to like just talk a little bit about the Slack channel. So there are many, many other Slack channels within this Slack org. You're welcome to look at any of them or access any of them. But this is the one for our class. So basically like over the weeks, like one of your homework assignments will be to like post in the Slack channel, like a model you found and played with inside Runway. So like you're welcome to use this as much as you want. So basically like this is our safe space for this class. Ask any questions you have, like no one will judge you for those questions. No one should judge you in any of the Slack channels, but like, you know, if you want to know where to ask, this is the place to ask to start with. Lee and I will be pretty active in here for the next couple weeks, so feel free to jump in there. There are many, many other channels. I'll just point out a couple, like the ones that you might be interested in and just sort of like looking around later is there's a Runway Slack, which is called /Runway or #Runway, and there's a bunch of comments in here, things people are playing with. You know, all these channels get a couple posts a week. You're welcome to be really active in them or not. It's sort of up to you. And then I would say the other one is there's a share projects. This is where people post a bunch of work that they've made or things they're working on. So you should also feel free to, like, if you made something that you really like in Runway, feel free to post it here or dig around and just sort of see what other people are making. Any other questions before we jump back into it? Cool. All right. Let's get back to lectures then. Leah, I'm going to have you share. Is that right?
Yep.
Cool.
Okay. Yeah, we'll jump right into, like, as Derek touched on right before break, some of the limitations of AI today. A lot of people are like, oh no, like the Terminator's coming. And people are afraid of this thing called artificial general intelligence, which is like, yeah, stuff like robots that can walk around and like do evil things, supercomputers. And as we'd like to emphasize, this is like the stuff of science fiction, and we are not anywhere near close like AI becoming sentient today. In contrast to general AI, there is narrow AI, which does exist today, which is code that does one thing really, really well, like what you trained it on, that little box of like training data. And if you give it anything outside of that, there's like no telling what kind of stuff it'll produce. So an example of that, of narrow AI, is this model. Let me play it. This is a model called AttnGAN. And literally what it does is it takes input of horse and outputs zebra. And that's like all it does. It can turn horses into zebras, and it can turn zebras into horses, but that's like all it can do. But it was really, really, really groundbreaking when it came out like a couple years ago, and people were super excited about it. But that's like all it can do. And so that's sort of like where the state of AI is today. And yeah, a little bit about the ML process. Derek, you want to go ahead and go through these?
Yeah, so so the basic process for machine learning is a number of things that we'll talk about in other weeks, but essentially we start with a thing called a data set. For most of the stuff we're going to be working on in this class, that will be a list of images. Then we go through a process called training, and then we do a thing called testing. So if you want to go to the next slide for me, Leah. Yeah, so data sets. So, you know, if you are at all on the internet, you probably are familiar with people talking about data sets. You talk about like, oh, Facebook has a ton of data on me. What does that mean? In many instances, like we think of data sets as being information about ourselves or maybe textual information. But in our case, like what we're going to be talking about is like a group of image data. So in this case, it's, I think the next slide actually, Leah, if you don't mind. Yeah, so this could be hundreds or thousands or even millions of images that we're going to be working with. And so like a machine learning, part of the machine learning process is some data scientist or more likely a data scientist intern goes across the internet and scrapes a bunch of different images from across the internet. And we'll talk a little bit about what that process looks like in a future session, but essentially like they go and they grab all these images, and then the data scientist or a machine learning engineer will build what we call a network or an architecture. So that is, yeah, this thing of, it's kind of the magic black box of stuff, and there's lots of different architectures. We won't really get into that too much this class, but if you're interested in learning more about those, I'm happy to send along some information. Essentially, they then they like push all of this data, these images, through this network, and these networks are meant to do this specific task, right? So learn representations of an image, learn features of an image. And then when you feed it all of the data and you do this training process, which usually takes days or weeks or months, at the very end, you get a thing called a model. And a model is now what you can do with that is you can then do what we call testing or inference, and basically you can now play with that model. So in this case, what you do is you take images or data or other pieces of content, and you do what we call inference. You push it through the model, and what you get out of it is the end result. So this is essentially the process of machine learning. So in the case of something like horse to zebra, which is the video we just looked at, what you do here is you're trained on images of horses and images of zebras. And the idea in the network or architecture here is like, can you find similarities between these images that will allow you to translate from one to the other? So what of the images are similar? What of the images are different? And how can we correlate those two together so that we can then generate a model that then can create either horses to zebras or zebras to horses? And then the next step would be, so once you've done the training, and then you do testing. And testing or inference or image generation, or like there's any number of terms of this is mostly what we're going to focus on in this class. So a lot of the models we'll be looking at are what are called pre-trained, meaning someone has already trained them. And our job is to just play with them and begin to generate images using that pre-trained model. So in the case of this testing, you give the model a horse and it comes back with a zebra. And it's pretty important to understand what this thing was tested or trained on. Because if you don't know what it's trained on, you don't know what it's supposed to do. And then, you know, as an artist, like our job is to either do exactly what the model expects or do what the model doesn't expect and then see what it returns. So for example, I didn't add this here, but like there's an image of Vladimir Putin sitting on a horse that was fed through this. And it's pretty scary looking. So I'll find it and I'll post it in our Slack channel because it's pretty interesting. But basically, like this is what you can do then is you can sort of like, again, sort of break the model by feeding it interesting content or sort of following along exactly and feeding it the content it expects. One of the things I think is really helpful to note in this particular example is, do you notice how, and we can look at the paper for this article if you're, or this model if you're interested, but one of the things you'll notice is that every time you convert a horse to a zebra, it doesn't convert just the zebra, right? So the zebra now has stripes and stuff on the same shapes of the horse, but you'll notice that the background is also like less saturated, right? So it's like more of a muddier green or that sort of thing. And one of the things you realize is that that the reason that is because horses live in like more desert or more arid lands, right? So, or sorry, zebras live in more arid lands or desert sort of regions. Not really deserts, but just like less green pastures. So the model will sometimes learn things that you do not expect it to learn, right? So you might say like, oh, I want the model to learn to convert a horse to a zebra. And what you get is like, the model also learned to convert the background. And maybe that's not what you want, but sometimes you don't have control over those sort of things. You're like, you then have to build the data set to only show horses versus zebras and that sort of thing. So one thing you will often commonly hear about is that the machine learning model is doing stuff it wasn't expected to do. You would hope data scientists and machine learning engineers are smart enough to recognize those things and fix them, but a lot of times they aren't. And a lot of times, like, and we'll talk about this throughout the next couple weeks, like these are not, for many people, these are examples and experiments and not necessarily things that are meant to be the final product. They're not meant to be put into production, right? So you will hear some very ghastly stories of people using models like this to take white people and make them look like black people. And obviously there's all sorts of ethical concerns about that. But, you know, some data scientists somewhere decided like, I don't care about the ethics, I just want to prove it can happen, right? So we as artists have to think a lot about like, what does it mean to convert these things together? Or what does it mean if there are things learned that we're not expecting to be learned? Do we want to expose those things? Do we not? Like, you know, how do we work with that? So those are also things we'll touch on briefly throughout the course. But I thought this was really, really interesting. And I hope this helps people understand like just sort of how the basics of machine learning models work. Any questions from anyone before we move on?
When was CycleGAN, like what year is it from?
I believe CycleGAN is from 2017. Although it's one of the people who worked on it has kept it sort of relatively up to date and improved it in certain ways. So a lot of times, and this is also something we'll find very, very quickly in Runway as well, especially around 2017, 2018, a lot of models were what designers or artists would refer to as low resolution. So I think CycleGAN started out as 256 by 256 images. You can now do like larger. I always say large in that like they're 1024 by 1024, which to many artists is like, you can't print that size. So it's not really that much larger, right? But yeah, so there's limitations of time, when they were produced, like a lot of machine issues around just sort of how big and how big of images these models can handle. Yeah. Leah, would you mind asking a question for the group?
Sure, yeah. I was curious about what informs the naming of these models, like CycleGAN and AttnGAN. Especially like cycle and attention don't seem intuitive to me for what they do.
Yeah, that's a great question. The truth is it's a little bit of a PR like move. So basically all these, and we'll look at this when we dive into Runway, each of these is written by a scientist and essentially is sort of like a scientific paper. And these papers tend to have very like mathy and like high level sounding names. Like I don't know exactly what CycleGAN is, but it's probably like something like cyclical, you know, image to image translation models, right? And like that paper does not roll off the tongue. So what people end up doing is they end up giving these models a name like CycleGAN or AttnGAN. And those names tend to come from the paper. So the reason CycleGAN is called CycleGAN is because it does a process of learning called cyclical something or other. So it becomes CycleGAN. The reason AttnGAN is called AttnGAN is because there's a theory or there's a concept in machine learning called attention, which is sort of the idea of like, we can tell a model what to look at. We can tell it where to focus its attention. And it happened to be one of the first papers that talked about attention. So like it has been named AttnGAN. So all these names, they will also start to blur together. So there's one called StyleGAN, and you might think StyleGAN is related to style transfer, and it is only very, very loosely. But yeah, these names get like, they get sort of confusing very quickly. There are also many different flavors of CycleGAN. And I would also think, I think one thing that's maybe important to know is CycleGAN is a architecture or a network. The model, horses to zebras or day to night or other things, like those are the models. And we'll look at that in Runway. So there can be an architecture of CycleGAN, but there's many different models that can be used doing that. So yeah, all this stuff gets very confusing. And if you ever are confused about any of this, just feel free to ask us. A lot of times I don't even know either. And it's just like, someone just named it and it like rolls off the tongue and now everyone uses it. So yeah. Cool, any other questions? All right, let's move on to the next stuff then.
All right. Yeah, so we'll spend the rest of the class talking about Runway, which is the program you guys will be focusing on. You can download it at runwayml.com. It's like pretty easy to install. Sort of what Runway is sort of Photoshop for machine learning models. It gives you access to a lot of pre-trained models, and you do not need to know how to code, which is really, really awesome because it removes a lot of huge hurdles to accessibility of people being able to use these models, and just makes it like, yeah, way easier than digging through a lot of code and like fixing things that don't like work. It's just, yeah, it's really awesome. This is a quote from Alison Parrish that Derek and I both really, really love. She was actually on Derek's slide from SFPC. She works with machine generated text, like poetry and words and language, the sounds of language. And she had this tweet which says, "Asking, can a computer generate Shakespeare, to me, is less interesting than asking, what would Gertrude Stein have made with TensorFlow?" And so, yeah, I just wanted to ask you guys, like, how do you interpret this quote? What does it mean to you? Do you have any questions about it? And get your thoughts on it.
Well, it's a tool, right? It's like it's enabling, not an end in itself, I guess.
Right, yeah, machine learning is a tool, and yeah, we're really happy that you guys are like thinking critically about the use of it as a tool, because yeah, I think there can be like sort of hairy use cases of machine learning as a tool if you're not thinking like I'm not thinking about like, oh, am I regenerating someone else's work? Am I trying to like use my data set, or in my data set, is it like the entirety of someone else's body of work? We really just want you guys to use your creativity and see machine learning as like a tool to create what you want to create. Oh, any other thoughts? Yeah.
Oh, I was just going to say, I mean, I guess it's redundant to what you said, but this, like, the can we do it, I think is a really, as you've mentioned, like, can be such a thorny and problematic way to view it. And so, yeah, for me, a question like, can it be done versus like, what are we doing, seems to be really important.
Right. Yeah. Like thinking like, what are the implications of this, rather than like, can I do that? I think, yeah, there are, I feel, some people who are working on machine learning who are doing like these, can I do this? Can I generate another Rembrandt type of questions? And yeah, we hope that we teach you guys to think more critically about the things you're making.
Yeah, and I'll just add to this, which is like, I think you'll see a lot of people talking in the machine learning world or like on Wired, you know, these like tech blogs where they'll be like, oh, well, pretty soon we can put artists out of business because a machine will be generating art, right? And it's like, you know, I think as designers and artists, we realize like that is not really art, right? Or like, there's so much more context to that. And I think what really stood out here is like, again, like for me personally, like I don't care about a machine, can a machine recreate Rembrandt? Like that's just not my interest, but more like what do like artists who are interested in formal properties or just interested in the contextual and critical opportunities of machine learning, what can they do with that work? And again, like each of you has your own body of or interest in art, whether it's photography or typography or other things. And like, well, we want to see you get out of this classes. How do you take that and apply it to machine learning, right? So it's not just like, how do you like learn what other artists are doing with machine learning and remake that? It's more like, what do you come with that you can apply to this work that is different than anyone else can? And we'll see some examples of that next week about like what other artists are doing with these tools that I think are really, really interesting.
All right, so with Runway specifically, the 3 steps of like training a machine learning model that Derek touched on, data sets, training, and testing, where Runway ML really, really exceeds is in the testing portion, where you are, you have access to a lot of models that are pre-trained, and you can take images and feed them through the model that's already trained. For making your own data sets, you will probably do that outside of Runway. And Runway does have training capabilities, although it is a little bit limited in that it's restricted to 2 specific types of models. But for the most part, you'll just be doing testing through Runway ML.
And just so folks know, we won't really be covering data sets or training in this course because this is more of an intro course. We have in other video, like in other classes, I've taught how to do training and build data sets inside of Runway. So if people are really interested in that, I'm happy to link you to those classes. And you're also like, feel free to ask me or Leah questions about that. Next, I will get into like sort of why we're not covering training in this course. But yeah, I just want to make it clear that like, we're going to mostly be working with testing and learning about different models and learning about the ins and outs of those things. But if you are interested in moving beyond that, like Leah and I are offering more classes throughout the rest of the year that will go a little bit more into detail in each of these. But we also have some materials already if you are interested in those.
Yeah, and so some downsides of, or like, yeah, you might view them as cons of Runway, are that you have access to all of these pre-trained models. Yeah, if you do want to do any kind of like more training on top of that, you have to like go outside of Runway generally. It doesn't include every model, although it includes like, I would feel like gives you access to a lot more than you usually would have access to. Although there is like a large world of models that are out there. As we mentioned, it does have limited training with the models you can train within Runway, and it can get a little bit expensive to use. Not like super expensive, but like on the order of like dollars and cents. Yeah, Derek, do you want to chime in for this bit?
Sure, yeah. So we'll talk about this as we do a demo of how Runway works, but essentially when you're doing the testing phases of your machine learning models, it is 5 cents per minute. So I believe if you just signed up for Runway for the very first time, I think they give you $15 in credits. And I know some of you have paid for additional credits as part of this class. Leah should have sent you the coupon code for that. If you didn't get it, let me know. And if you didn't buy credits, that's totally fine. You can buy them through Runway. It's pretty straightforward. So it's 5 cents per minute. I would say $30, $40 is going to be plenty for this class. That'll cover you for sure. If you are interested in doing training, you now have to have a subscription to do training, which is sort of why we decided to skip it for this class. It costs more money. It just tends to be a little bit frustrating to like, I can't gift anyone subscriptions because of the monthly, like whatever. So, but you do have to buy a subscription. It is either $15 a month or $145 a year. Once you have that subscription, then it costs 5 cents or like half a cent per step of training. You don't even know what that means. I cover it in some of my other videos if you are interested in that. So just be aware, like there are other parts of spending money on Runway. It can get fairly expensive. I will say if you find that you're using Runway pretty frequently, a subscription is pretty helpful because then when you buy credits, you get it's like the MTA. It's like you buy $10 in credits and they give you $1 extra or whatever. So it could be helpful if you're interested in really using Runway a lot, but for this class, it's fine if you just like take the $15 in free credits and like maybe you might be able to get away with just that. You might need to add $10 or $20 more. But yeah, just to let you know, the pricing is not cheap, but it's also like, quite honestly, I use it myself and I know how to code stuff. There's certain benefits to Runway, which we'll talk about for the next couple weeks over anything else. So yeah. Cool, and then I'll take this stuff as well. So Runway, which we're gonna dive into in just a minute, is broken up into sort of like a couple different parts of just the way that the UI works. So it's broken up into models, which we've already started talking about, right? The models are where you can go and see what's available to you to start testing with. Workspaces are essentially where you actually do that work. We'll talk a little bit more about how workspaces are important to things like chaining in a week or two, but essentially what you do is you take a model, you say, I want to add this to this workspace, and, excuse me, and then you can actually start doing the work. So that's like sort of how it works. Training, we won't really cover in this class, but training is where you do your training. Exports is a fairly new feature. And also, like, I probably need to update my slides about pricing. Once you have a model working in a way that you want to, you could do like a batch export using their exports feature, and the pricing is a lot cheaper. I think it ends up being like 1 cent an image or less. So it ends up saving you some time. So, you know, we'll talk about like sort of the workflow for this, but you could use exports to help you like batch process things and save yourself some money. And lastly, we'll talk about settings. Also, I should add another one here that is brand new, which is called hosted models. So if you ever want to like build your own website using a machine learning model, Runway can now help you do that. I probably will just briefly touch on it in this class at the end, like in our last week, but I also have a video for that if you're really interested in it. So basically building a website that does some machine learning stuff is cool, but it could also get really expensive. We'll talk about that as well. And then lastly, settings. So settings are where you're gonna like basically be able to check on your account, add credits, pay for things, that sort of thing. Yeah. So at this point, I think it's probably best if I just jump right into sharing my screen and then walking us through how Runway works. All right, so where do I go? There it is. Okay, cool. You guys can see my screen, right? You see Runway? All right, awesome, cool. So this is the Runway interface. When you first log in, you will probably see something that looks just like this. Actually, what you will really see, let me just do that again, Runway. You will see, 1 second here. You'll see this screen, right? So you'll see a screen that says welcome back. You have the option of browsing models, opening your workspaces, or training a model. For most of us, I just recommend going and browsing models. So like for your first time, just come in and check out some things. So inside of here, this is a list of every model that they have available. And my guess is that for many of you, if you've did Runway before taking this class, you probably look through here and you're like, what is all this? What do I do with all this, right? And this is sort of the hurdle that I find with Runway, right? Is like, so AttnGAN is buried somewhere in here. How do I go find it? How do I learn how it works? So this is your models interface. So along the left-hand side here are your tabs. This little box is models. This space above here is your workspaces. This is training. This is exports, and this is hosted models. I tend to spend most of my time in the models and workspaces tab. And the way models works is they recently added these quick action features up here, which we'll talk a little bit more about some of these next week. But what's nice is they sort of wrote in here like what each of them does. So remove backgrounds from people, removing backgrounds from objects, estimating depth, which maybe you know what that means, maybe you don't, doesn't matter. And then upscaling images and colorize, so turning images from black and white to color. So one thing to know about all of these models is that generally like they are built by like normal people on the internet, and like people have uploaded just whatever they want to here. So sometimes the naming of these is not like the most clear, right? Like first order motion model for image animation is a very popular model, but you might not know what it means and you might not know how it works from that name alone. So a lot of times you have to do some deep investigation or just like click around and try to figure out what these things do before playing with them. So my recommendation for most folks is to start by going through the categories. So in here, there is a thing called category, and you'll see there's a community category, which is called StyleGAN, which maybe you've heard of, maybe you don't know what that means. We'll talk about that in a minute. Image synthesis, motion capture, text-based, recognition, post-processing, style transfer, and workflow. So I find that the categories help me understand what each of these is meant to do, and then go into each model from there. So why don't we go into, let's actually look at the image synthesis selection here. So when you come in here, you'll see each of these is now a model. So it says, generate similar images based on the image input image. Maybe you don't know what that means. Text image generation. Well, you having just done this demo, you might realize that that is AttnGAN. And you'll see here it's tagged as AttnGAN. So there's a lot of deciphering of things we have to do here. This last one is generate images from 1,000 categories. So my next recommendation or next step that I recommend people do is when you're hovering over these models, you'll see here that there is a link to learn more and there's a link to add to workspace. If you've never messed with one of these models before, I highly recommend that you actually click on learn more. So let's actually do this with AttnGAN. So let's go to learn more. And this comes to what is called the model page. Again, each of these is written maybe well, maybe poorly. It's kind of hard to tell sometimes. So text to image generation. So this is called AttnGAN, fine-grained text to image generation with attentional generative adversarial networks. So this is where AttnGAN gets its name. Turn text descriptions of scenes into synthesized images. So this is basically, this helps you understand what it does and how it's been done. There are gallery images up here, although I would say like in many cases they are not great. So here is an example of a photo of a homemade swirly pasta with broccoli, carrots, and onions. So for those of you that don't know, this is a photo from the paper. So again, there are science papers written about each one of these models. You could, I know that that's what this is from, but it's not clear. So again, like, because this is sort of community hosted, lots of stuff gets thrown into Runway, and it isn't like, you know, no UX designer has gone in and said like, how should we like tell people about these things? So a lot of it is just like, you kind of have to learn on your own. So actually one of the things that Leah and I are doing as a part of this class and have been doing over time is like, we're actually gonna go through a couple popular models and record videos and explain like what they're trained on, how they work, and like do a quick demo. So your homework is we're gonna kind of throw you in the deep end and you're gonna have to figure it out yourself. But next week, we're gonna start to give you a list of models that we've gone through and sort of documented. So if you are interested in that, like we'll start sharing those this week. So this is the page here. One thing to note is that along your right-hand column here. Okay, Bug, hi. You guys get to meet my cat who's been yelling at me. This is Bug. She's gonna cuddle while I talk. Okay, maybe not, all right. So as I was saying, along the right-hand side here, there's maybe some helpful information. You can see who published the model. So this is actually published by the Runway team, which I would argue they might need to document this better if they want people using it, but that's beside the point. Attributions are the people who actually made the model. So this was apparently came from like the part of the Microsoft team, which I actually wasn't aware of. Maybe I've skipped that. Some characteristics, which I find helpful, but not hugely helpful. If you are interested in licensing issues or whatever, they do note what license is used here. Keywords, which I tend to find not super helpful. And then at the bottom here, this is what I tend to look at most as a designer or someone who knows how engineering works. There's a link to the research paper, which if you open that up, it takes you to a poorly formatted PDF that you can download and print out and read. This is the paper that the scientists wrote when they were like documenting this model. I don't know how to read half of the mathematics stuff in here. I often very rarely understand what they're talking about, but I'll still download it and read it because I do find that if you gloss over certain terms or other things, you can get a sense of what it was trained on, what the idea is behind it works, and then maybe like some tips on how it operates. So one thing that is helpful in many of these models, they do show images. Like there's this little, this image here. So you'll see this bird is red and white with very short beak. So you can like almost decipher how this model works, right? It's like looking at various features of the bird and maybe kind of guessing that this is like somehow describing the images. Down here, if you are into machine learning or know how these network graphs work, they do have some examples of this. This can look scary at first. I am very aware that this looks scary. When I download these and read these, I still find them scary. So my general view is just like read through it, like gloss over anything you don't know. Maybe Google some things if you really are interested. But in most part, like I look at the pictures. There are often pretty pictures here that help me understand what's going on, right? So like that swirly pasta image came from here. So papers are really helpful to understand how things work. You might also, if you do programming or coding and you want to see how these things are built, they do usually link to the GitHub repo for each of these. So this is basically how I go through and learn about models. It is definitely time consuming. It is not my favorite thing in the world, but just so you know, like you can do this if you really want to like dig in and unpack these things. So let's talk about like if we find a model that we want to use, how do we add it, how do we play with it, that sort of thing. So I'm actually going to go to a model that I built and I brought into Runway, which is called Munit. This is a model that, oops, let's go back to here. Let's click on Learn More. So this is a model that I've documented is faces to flowers. I trained it myself outside of Runway and then brought it into Runway. This essentially takes faces and converts into like these flowery abstract shapes. So you'll see in the gallery, I definitely need to add more images, but you see a face that looks kind of flowery. If you go to the overview, you'll see Munit is a multimodal version of unpaired image translation network, which is a very wordy to say. It's like CycleGAN, but it includes a style parameter to get multiple style outputs from one model. So there you go. So let's say, cool, this is what I want to play with. The important thing to do is there's two ways you can add to workspace by going on the model page, going over here and going add to workspace. And then you can add it to a new workspace, or when you're back on this page, you can click on add to workspace right here. And when you click on this, it's just actually going to add it to your latest workspace. Let's actually clean this up a little bit here. So all of your workspaces will be listed here. And you can have multiple workspaces. The only thing to know is that a workspace is what allows you to actually test your model. So a model has to be in a workspace in order to use it. You can name these things whatever you want. So let's call this just a unit sample. What happened there? All right, so the next thing to know now that things are in a workspace is you've got inputs and outputs, right? So we talked about how when a model is trained, when you want to test it, you've got to have an input and you've got to have an output. So what we might gather from the model that like we saw is that this takes photos of faces as an input and converts them to like flowery photos as an output. So there's a couple ways we could do this. So inside of Runway, you'll see at the top here, there is an image input, and this takes either a camera, so it can like pull in my camera, or it will take a file. And so let's start with a camera. And if we turn on camera, you will have to give it access to your machine or whatever. So you'll see here, like now it's got my face here. So the idea is that hopefully it will take my face and convert it to a flowery face. We'll talk a little bit more over the next couple weeks about like what goes on over here on the side. But just know that when you're using an image model, you can sort of tweak these numbers to like, you know, I can make this a little bit smaller so it runs faster. I can make it larger. I could mess with the saturation. So if I wanted just a black and white, I could do that. There's a bunch of stuff that comes for free in Runway to like sort of mess with these. To get this model running, you have to click on this run remotely button. So one thing to know is like up until now, I have not been charged any amount of money. I can go in, I can look at models, I can play around as long as I want to, and it's free. As soon as I click this run remotely button, which I'm going to do now, it is going to start charging me 5 cents a minute. So it's important to know that like you don't want to leave these things running for hours. And in fact, Runway has now built in a thing that if it's not being used, it turns off after a short period of time. So now that this is running, you'll see here that at the top, we've got my input. And at the bottom here, we've got my output. Now, I will admit that this model sometimes doesn't work as well as I would like it to. So in this case, you know, you can kind of see my face. The flowers are a little splotchy, but it's working and it's generating images at about 1 image per second. So it's not the fastest thing, but it works. If I wanted to generate faster images, I would probably make my size smaller. So now I'm looking at like about a third of a second per image. But the output's a lot messier. So you get what you get out of it. So what's cool about this model? So this model is like CycleGAN, right? It is translating one image to another image. But what's cool about this model is if I switch my little style thing up here. And now I get a different output. Sorry. Almost made it. Okay, so I can change this.
Looks like it didn't get your mug.
What's that?
Looks like it didn't get your mug.
Oh.
Oh, it has it now. Just like really subtle.
Yeah, so this is the thing about this model is like sometimes it works well and sometimes it doesn't. And I found that it's like generally like based on whatever image you're seeing, it works or it doesn't. So what I might do is I would actually like, I'm gonna stop this for a second. I'm gonna turn off the camera. I'm gonna switch to the file. So let's find a file, like a good photo of someone here. I was trying to do, sorry, also my desktop's an absolute disaster, just to warn everyone. But let's see, I have better images here. I don't know where they went off to. Let's just grab one of these. I have this Angela Davis image. It might work. Let's see. So one thing you will know is like oftentimes it'll warn you if you upload a high-res image. Oh man. All right, so this is 1200 by 1200. Let's just make it a little bit smaller and let's run it. Let's see what happens. All right, that's actually not terrible. This is better than I expected. So here again, we have an image. So now we're producing these images. Now let's say I really like this one and I want to save it. One of the things you can do is in the right-hand corner here, you can hit save image. And then you can choose where you want to save this. You can rename it. I'm just going to save this to my desktop. This will save out the image. Now what's important to know is that because my input looks like 799 or whatever, the output size is being pushed here as well. So the input size and output size match in this model. In other models, they might not. So in other models, you might upload a 1024 by 1024 and it automatically gets reduced to a smaller size. So you do kind of have to be aware of like what sizes you're getting like resized to or other things here. So just be aware of that. This is a case of where, in this case, I can change this style a little bit. So you will see that each of these styles, sometimes some of them pick up better details than others. So you might just have to play with this a little bit. Like that one is clearly not good for this particular face. But one other thing you could do, sorry, go ahead.
Oh, Tanvi had a question. Do you want to ask it?
Yeah.
Oh yeah, sure. So I was curious if you're able to run this locally on your CPU or like use your computer's GPU if you have like a beefed up.
Yeah, great question. So if you have a local GPU and you're on a Linux, you might be able to run it locally. Most image generation models require a GPU. So I would say that for most people, I recommend just using Runway's servers. It is a cost, but I also find that like setting up Linux and setting up a Docker and other things is like very like time consuming. So you can run your own. Some of the text generation models can run on a CPU. And if you click on show advanced options here, you can switch to, this model doesn't even allow you to do that, but there are options on other models where you can switch to your local and then CPU. Just know that CPU will generally be way, way slower. So whereas this generates an image, a high-res image in 4 seconds, if you were to switch this to your CPU, it might take a couple minutes to like 30 minutes. It's very, very slow. So yeah, you can, but just know that there's usually a large payoff or like decrease in whatever, large costs associated to that. So yeah. So this is sort of it for the demo. This is all I want to cover for today, just to sort of show you like basic finding a model and then bringing it into your workspace. So I'm going to stop sharing and then Leah, I'm going to let you share and really quickly cover our homework for the week.
Yep. Cool. Yeah, so now that you guys have like gotten a taste of what Runway looks like, we want you guys to go ahead and play with it for the next week. Yeah, just find a couple models that you find interesting. Pick one at least to make a post in Slack about what the name of the model is, what the inputs and outputs were. Like for example, the AttnGAN, the input was text, like a sentence, and the output was an image. Any questions you have about the model, and yeah, just post any cool images or videos that produced or maybe be like, this model is terrible, or yeah, just anything interesting that came out of it. The second assignment is if you do want to make like a larger project and tie together all your homeworks, just sort of start thinking about that. We'll be giving you guys more inspiration next class, but in the meantime, you can also check out the Runway Slack and the Runway YouTube channel. They have a lot of cool projects that people have made with Runway. And then also, when you're scrolling through Runway, looking at models, consider what you have available, like what you have uniquely available to yourself as inputs. So maybe you're a photographer, or you're like a motion designer, or you have like a large collection of comic books that you can scan, which was, yeah, one of our students scanned all of his comic books. And also what you want as outputs, like do you want to produce images, do you want to produce video, what sort of like, yeah, medium or materials you want to create in your final project. Yeah, and with that, that kind of concludes our class. We're gonna move to like quick couple minutes of open Q&A, but also we'll have our open office hours / co-working session scheduled later. And also you can ask questions in Slack if questions come up as you're doing the homework.
And also add, so we went over a little over time this week. We try not to. And the other thing I would say is that should you need to leave at any point, feel free. We are recording the videos. So we tend to do these Q&As, and like sometimes they drag on, and I'm gonna not let them drag on this time. But sometimes they drag on for like 30 minutes and people have lots of questions. You do not have to stick around. You, like, I know people generally will feel like, oh, I want to hear what they're asking or whatever. Like we'll always find them afterward. But with the new sort of like open working session, I'm hoping to answer more questions during that time for people as well. But are there any immediate questions about the homeworks or other things before you get started and before we take off for the day? And Matthew asked, yeah, go ahead. Yeah.
Oh yeah, I was just going to say, is the Google Doc going to be on Slack or emailed later, just so we can have access to the poll and go through it again, maybe?
Yeah, so we'll definitely link to at the class channel or the class webpage, which is at the top of the Slack channel. We'll be posting all of the docs, so basically like the slides as well as all the videos when they're finished processing. We'll go there. So we'll always have access to those. Those will never go away. Yes.
I had a question. I noticed that Runway has like a Photoshop plugin functionality that I actually played with a bit. Are there any obstacles or hurdles to like implementing that with, you know, one of our projects?
Yeah, so we'll look at the Photoshop plugin at the week 3. I would say the biggest hurdle with that is that it only works with a couple models right now. I believe it's like it uses the image segmentation color coding to map, and there's only like three other models that use that. So there are, I think they maybe have updated more. Part of the reason why I'm saying that for week 3 is I need to go through it a little bit more and have better responses to it. But I would say play with it and see what you can get to work and what you can't. Yeah, there are also plugins, I believe, for Unity, a couple other models. I think there's a new one for Grasshopper. So if you are interested in those, let me know. I don't use all those tools, so sometimes I don't do demos because I just don't use them. But if you are interested in those, I'm happy to walk through it and figure it out with you. And then in week 3, we'll also look at P5.js, which is like a really like simple like coding language built on processing for JavaScript. So we'll look at how to use P5.js to manipulate some of these models as well.
I was wondering if you could talk about, just briefly touch on how you built your model, the one with the flower faces, and also if you could sort of touch on what's happening at the back end when you're changing the style.
Yeah, great question. So basically the way that worked is you train your model like you would train any Munit model, and sometimes you have to learn how that works. Munit happens to be it was created by the NVIDIA developers, and they documented pretty well like how to train it. So you do the training process. I did it on a server that I run. It took a couple days to train. Once you have the model, then you need to port, you basically like, so Runway has an SDK that allows you to convert a model that is already in Python to a Runway specific model and like using some of the API calls they have to generate the UI and that sort of thing. So I did that. The first one is very hard to do. Once you learn how it works, it's a little bit easier, but actually it's one of the things I want to record a video on in the next couple weeks. So I'll probably do that as well. So for some of you that are more engineering focused and interested in that, I'll record that and we can take a look at it. Regardless, you still have to do the training somewhere else. So I had to do it on a server. Bring that in. The way the style thing works is that Unit just has like a lot of these models are built around like you can inject noise into them and noise changes the output. So there is Unit, and this gets really, really in the weeds, but Unit is actually, it is 2 different GAN models and what's called a variational autoencoder. So it's like a pretty complicated model. And I honestly would never build it or know how it works myself, but I was able to train on it. So I basically like, when you do the style, you're injecting a certain like sort of bit of noise in the model and it picks from a different sort of space within the model. Yeah. If you are interested in a lot of this stuff, like if you're interested in like sort of like the backend side of things, like we won't be covering that as much in this class, but we do have some videos from like my AttnGAN courses that might help a little bit more with that. And I'm also happy to like link to resources around stuff that I have found that helped me. You know, there are lots of other video series out there that are a little bit more technically inclined. So if you are interested in that, like just let me know and we'll link to some stuff. All right, so please try to answer the poll in the next day or two, just so that way we, and Leah, maybe you can just repost it in the Slack channel. That way people can let us know and we can set up some co-working time. You are always welcome to ask questions either in our Slack channel or directly to Leah and I over DM. We're happy to respond whenever we can. We'll try to answer pretty quickly. But with that, I hope everyone has a good week. Hope everyone has fun playing around in Runway. And yeah, just let us know if you have any questions and we'll all be in touch soon. All right, thanks everybody. Have a good rest of your day.
Thank you guys.
Thank you.
Thanks.
Bye.
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 Bye.